Hello Stat 200 and welcome to the Lesson 1 overview video. For every lesson, there'll be a short video such as this one. This video is meant to just give you a summary of the topics that you're going to be reading about this week. I recommend that you watch this video twice. Once at the beginning of the week to get an idea of what you're going to be learning about, and then again towards the end of the week before you take the lesson quiz to make sure that you're comfortable with all of the content that's covered in that lesson. These are the key topics that you're going to be learning about in Lesson 1. In this video, we'll very briefly cover each of these. First, you'll learn about variable types. A variable is a characteristic that is measured and can take on different values. In other words, it varies. Variables can be categorized in a number of different ways. This is the scheme that we're going to be using in this class. We'll have categorical variables, which can be nominal or ordinal, and quantitative variables, which can be discrete or continuous. In the online notes this week, you'll see a few examples of each of these. Within a research study, variables can also be classified as explanatory or response. You may also hear explanatory variables be described as independent variables or predictor variables. Response variables are also known as dependent variables. In some research studies, we use one variable to predict or explain differences in another variable. In those cases, we would say that the explanatory variable predicts or explains variation in the response variable. Explanatory response variables are not present in all research studies. For example, at the end of this course, you'll learn about correlation and correlational studies, which just look for an association between two variables and do not attempt to use one to explain the other. Now let's move on to inference. We often have questions concerning large populations, and it's not feasible to collect data from all individuals in those large populations. In those situations, we gather information from a smaller sample to make an inference about the larger population. So before we can really talk about inference, we need to define samples and populations. The population is the set of all possible observations in which we're interested in. In other words, this is everyone in the group that you want to study. However, because this group is very large, it could be too expensive, too time-consuming, or just not practically possible to collect data from every one of these individuals. So in those cases, we use a sampling method, which we'll talk about next, to obtain a smaller subset known as the sample. We can use information from this sample to make an inference about the larger population. This is known as inferential statistics, and this is what you'll be learning about in the second half of this course. There are a few different ways that we can select a sample from the larger population. These are some of the more common methods. In this course, we're only going to be talking about simple random sampling and convenience sampling, though you should note that stratified random sampling and cluster sampling are also popular methods. In simple random sampling, which is a probability-based method, every member of the population has an equal chance of being selected. In this week's lab assignment, you'll see how you can use Minitab Express to take a simple random sample from a known population. Convenience samples are also very popular. While simple random sampling methods are often preferred, convenience sampling methods are often used for practical reasons. For example, a researcher may not have access to the entire population. Or we may be dealing with a situation in which it's not ethical to randomly select individuals to participate in our research study, so we can only use people who volunteer to participate. A volunteer sample is a type of convenience sample. Later in this course, when we learn about inferential statistics, you'll spend a lot of time thinking about sampling variation. Samples randomly drawn from the same population will not all be identical. You'll see this in your lab assignment this week. You'll take a few simple random samples from the same population, and you'll see that each one is different. This is due to random sampling variation. Inferential statistics takes this sampling variation into account when using data from a sample to make an inference about the population. Next, we'll learn about bias. Bias is a systematic favoring of certain outcomes. This is not random sampling error or actual differences in the population. We'll learn about non-response and response bias this week. With non-response bias, individuals who participate differ from those who do not participate. So when we're conducting research using people have the right to participate or not participate in a research study. Non-response bias occurs when there's a difference between those who choose to participate and those who choose not to participate. Response bias occurs when participants respond untruthfully. This is a real concern when you're conducting research on topics that may be considered personal or private. For example, if you're doing research on sexual activity or sexuality in some sort, or cheating. Topics where people may not feel comfortable telling the truth, they may be more likely to give the researcher the response that is more socially acceptable. Research studies can be classified as experimental or observational studies. The question you need to ask when determining if you're looking at an experimental or an observational study is the researcher making any manipulations? If the answer is yes, the researcher is making manipulations, so the researcher is impacting the experience of the participants, then this is an experimental study. If the answer is no, the researcher is not making any manipulations, then this is an observational study. And the last point that I want to cover in this video is random sampling versus randomization. Students often confuse these two terms. Random sampling is a sampling method. It's a probability-based method for selecting a sample from a population. So random sampling refers to how you go from the whole population to select a sample. Randomization, on the other hand, refers to the random assignment of participants to treatment groups. So randomization is not concerning sampling. In randomization, you have the sample. It could be a simple random sample or a convenience sample, any type of sample. But with randomization, you are randomly assigning your participants to different treatment groups, maybe a treatment group and a control group. Lesson 1 has a ton of terminology. If you go through the online notes, these are all the bolded vocabulary terms that you'll find this week. I recommend making flashcards, either with index cards or using an online tool or an app to practice these terms, because these are terms that you're going to see coming up throughout the rest of the semester. The ones that are particularly important, I would say, are those concerning variables. So in just about every lesson this semester, we're going to talk about methods for categorical variables versus quantitative variables. When we learn about making graphs, and later in the semester when we learn about regression, you'll need to distinguish between explanatory variables and response variables. When we talk about inferential statistics in the second half of this course, we're going to talk about samples and populations constantly, and sample statistics versus population parameters. So make sure at the end of this week that you have a good understanding of all of these terms. If you have any questions, every week there'll be a discussion board in Canvas. So this week you can post your questions to the Lesson 1 discussion board.